Welcome to the backstage of one of the most twisted frenemy relationships in human history. Imagine you and your neighbor share the same landlord, the same gate key, and even the same security guard. Yet every time you step into their yard to borrow a lawnmower or sell a basket of eggs, they call the police to arrest you for illegal trespassing. That was exactly the bittersweet and absurd situation of Scotland and England in the late 17th century, where the phrase "strangers on the same path" wasn't a cheesy song title, but a brutal economic reality. This was sealed by the Navigation Acts. To understand why Scotland fell into this trap, we must look at the irony of history. In 1603, after Queen Elizabeth I of England passed away without an heir, King James VI of Scotland hit the jackpot when he was invited to take the throne in London, becoming James I of England. Thus, two nations suddenly shared a single king. The Scots were certain, "That's it, we're family now." They thought they could freely dine in London or trade tea in America. But life is no dream, and the English had no intention of sharing their lucrative colonial cake with anyone, not even their brother under the same king. To the English MPs sitting at Westminster, Scotland remained nothing more than a foreign country, perhaps even more formidable than France or the Netherlands because of its crime of being too close. And so, the Navigation Acts were born as a cunning doorblocker. This wasn't just a dry legal document, it was an economic noose tightening around Scotland's throat. The first and most brutal regulation was the ban on direct trade. Remember, this was an era where gold wasn't found in the ground, but on ships carrying tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Jamaica, or spices from India. Scotland, with its beautiful ports in Glasgow or Leith, was turned into reluctant spectators, watching the world's wealth flow right past their eyes. A Scottish merchant wanting to sell linen to America? Please, stop by the Port of London first. Pay a heap of taxes to English customs, unload the goods, then reload them onto an English ship and pay an exorbitant shipping fee. By then, your profit would barely buy a bowl of thin porridge. The English were extremely consistent in playing dirty by establishing a transport monopoly. They declared that all goods to and from English colonies must be carried by English ships, or ships from the colonies themselves. To add insult to injury, they inserted an infuriating clause. The crew had to be at least 75% genuine English. This struck directly at Scotland's pride and pockets. Scotland had a long maritime tradition. Scottish sailors were famous for being tough and resilient. But suddenly, they became unemployed in their own home. Scottish ships, no matter how modern or fast, were only allowed to roam the cold North Sea to catch herring or carry coal, while the maritime Silk Roads all had no entry signs hung by their neighbor. This separation created a satirical paradox. Scotland was so poor they were eating grass, while just south of the border, the English were busy building magnificent mansions with money from tobacco and sugar. The Navigation Acts weren't just a trade barrier, they were a clear political message. We share a king in bed, but at the economic banquet, you are not invited. This pushed Scotland into an extreme psychological state. On one hand, they were furious at being belittled. On the other, they were driven mad by the desire to get rich. It was this feeling of being abandoned, of being made a stranger in the empire, that their own king ruled, which forged the insane plan called Darien. Forbidden from entry everywhere, the Scots told themselves, "If you won't let us share your colonies, we will create our own." A place where your navigation acts are nothing but scrap paper. They looked at the map and saw Panama, a narrow strip of land they believed would be the funnel catching all the world's gold. They poured every last penny, from widows' savings to the estates of the nobility, into this gamble just to escape the grip of the Navigation Acts. They wanted to prove that they didn't need the British. They didn't need ships with 75% British crews to become wealthy. But tragically, it was the Navigation Acts themselves that dealt the final blow to the Darien dream. As the first Scottish settlers landed in the swamps of Panama and began dying from disease and starvation, King William III, busy pleasing the London merchants, issued a royal decree based on the spirit of the Navigation Acts. He forbade all English governors in the Caribbean from aiding the Scots. When tattered Scottish ships docked in Jamaica to beg for fresh water and food, they were kicked out for not following legal procedures. The English would rather see their brothers die in the jungle than let them create a loophole in their trade monopoly system. The consequence of turning Scotland into a stranger wasn't just a financial bankruptcy. It was the greatest handover of sovereignty in history. After Darien collapsed, Scotland had nothing. No money, no ships, no colonies, and an economy strangled by the Navigation Acts. Only then did the English smile and offer a contract. Want to be treated like family? Want to trade tobacco and sugar freely without being harassed by us? Sign here, dissolve your parliament, merge with us, and you will no longer be strangers. It was an incredibly steep price, but Scotland had no way back. In 1707, the Acts of Union were signed, and Scotland officially became part of the United Kingdom. The ultimate irony followed the merger. The Scottish merchants, those who had been tormented to their wits' end by the Navigation Acts, turned out to be incredibly sharp. Once the colonial doors were opened, they rushed in like a whirlwind. The city of Glasgow went from a tiny town to the, quote, tobacco capital of all Europe. The Scots, once banned from being sailors, now became the leading administrators, doctors, and engineers of the British Empire. Continuing our journey through the list of agonies that Scotland had to endure, we arrive at the second chapter of this economic tragedy, how the English strangled the last financial lifelines of their neighbor. If the Navigation Acts were a tightening hoop on the outside, then the taxation and suppression of key industries were the knife twists, cutting off every opportunity for wealth from within Scotland. Imagine Scotland at that time like an enthusiastic young man locked in an empty room with a starving stomach. Right in the next room, the English are hosting a lavish feast, with the aroma of Virginia tobacco and the sweet taste of Caribbean sugar. The Scottish youth only wants to join the fun, or at least buy some leftovers to start a small business, but the answer from the neighbor is always, sure, but the entrance fee is a fortune, and every bite you take must be taxed by me. First, let's talk about tobacco and sugar, the superfoods and super profits of the 17th century. These were not just commodities, they were the pure gold of that era. Merchants in Glasgow early on realized that their future lay in the vast tobacco fields of Virginia. They yearned to bring ships full of tobacco back to their home ports to sell across Europe. But the Navigation Acts erected a legal firewall. Every bale of tobacco or bag of sugar from English colonies had to dock at an English port first. The irony was this: to get a single cigar, a Scottish merchant had to watch the goods sail right past his nose, enter a rival's port, be hit with all sorts of import-export taxes, storage fees, and middleman markups. Only then were they allowed to buy it back at sky-high prices. The result? Scottish consumers paid double for things they could have imported directly, while profits flowed straight into the pockets of London financiers. The English weren't just selling goods. They were selling the permission to buy goods to their own kinsmen. But if tobacco and sugar were luxury dreams, then wool and linen were the bread and butter, the traditional pride of the Scottish people. This was a national soul industry where thousands of Scottish farming families poured their hearts into weaving cloth under oil lamps. However, the English had their own textile industry, and they had no desire to see Scottish linen dominate their market. Instead of competing fairly on quality, the English used their ultimate weapon: punitive import duties. They erected towering tax barriers against Scottish linen, making these goods far too expensive for English consumers. Scotland lost its largest, closest, and most potential market right next door. It's like opening a brilliant bakery, only to have your wealthy neighbor pass a law stating that anyone carrying your bread across his property line must pay a fee equal to half the price of the loaf. This deadlock created a terrible chain effect. An agriculture already crippled by famine grew even more dismal without textile exports. Cash vanished, inventory piled up, and resentment rose like the North Sea tide. The Scots realized a bitter truth. In a rapidly globalizing world, without colonies to provide raw materials and a free market to consume products, their nation would forever remain a backward province pushed to the margins of history. It was this feeling of being suffocated that turned despair into reckless action. With every door to legitimate trade locked tight by the English, the Scots began to dream of a free port, a place where tobacco didn't have to pass through England, and where Scottish linen could go straight to the world's consumers. That was the moment the Darien Scheme stopped being just a business idea and became a survival exit. They weren't just investing money in Panama, they were investing their final hopes, all to break the English economic blockade. They would rather bet everything on a distant gamble than wait to die slowly under the grip of absurd tax laws on their own land. When the front door of legitimate trade was slammed shut with a thunderous thud from London, the Scots did not sit down to cry or surrender. Instead, they took a deep breath, squinted toward the Atlantic horizon, and whispered to themselves, "If you won't let us use the front door, we'll turn this entire sea into an open window." This was the start of a dramatic historical chapter, where Scottish merchants transformed themselves from honest businessmen into ninjas of the ocean, masters of the art of loophole hunting and large-scale smuggling that would make even the most notorious pirates tip their hats. Let's talk about Glasgow, the city later known as the tobacco capital. But before earning that glittering title, Glasgow was a den of geniuses in the art of night walking. Since the Navigation Acts had turned the direct import of Virginia tobacco into a criminal offense, Glasgow merchants decided that laws were merely suggestions for reference. They began establishing a smuggling network so sophisticated it drove the British Royal Navy to the brink of madness. Scottish ships, instead of sailing boldly into main ports under their own flags, chose secluded little coves and rocky coastlines where British patrols dared not venture. There, in the dead of night, crates of fragrant tobacco were passed hand to hand as quickly as a scandalous secret. Glasgow merchants weren't just trading goods, they were trading in pure adrenaline. They built secret tunnels beneath warehouse floors, designed ships with double-layered hulls, and even bribed customs officials to keep their eyes wide shut. For them, every puff of smuggled tobacco inhaled in Edinburgh was a glorious victory, a direct slap to the economic golden hoop that London was trying to tighten. The beauty of the Scots was that they never put all their eggs in one basket. When smuggling with American colonies became too hot under the Navy's watch, they immediately turned to their old friends in Europe. The Netherlands and France were the ideal partners. The Scots had a deep-rooted history with France through the Old Alliance, so they figured shaking hands with England's enemies was both profitable and satisfying for their national pride. They shipped linen and coal to Rotterdam or Bordeaux in exchange for wine, silks, and the luxury goods that the English were desperately trying to block them from accessing. However, fate teased Scotland once again. The English of that era seemed to have a peculiar hobby: going to war. Every fortnight, England would declare war on France or the Netherlands. Consequently, Scotland was sucked into a geopolitical whirlpool they never asked for. The paradox was that, despite being an independent nation with no beef of their own, they shared a king with England. Scottish merchant ships automatically became legal targets for French and Dutch warships. Scotland found themselves in a bitter, innocent bystander situation. A poor Scottish merchant who had just slipped past the British patrols to bring goods to France might find himself intercepted and sunk by a French warship for the crime of being a subject of the British king. Scottish merchant ships, not armed to the teeth like English ones, became easy prey on the open sea. National wealth slowly sank to the bottom of the ocean or was confiscated as war prizes. This left an already fragile economy utterly exhausted. This deadlock pushed Scottish creativity to a new level, albeit one of desperation. They started playing a game of name-changing for their vessels. A ship named Scotland yesterday might fly a Dutch flag today and carry fake papers from some American colony next week. They learned to read tide charts, predict the wind direction for patrol ships, and even mastered the art of bribing with the finest Highland whiskey. But no matter how clever they were, the price of jumping the fence was too high. The risk of losing a life's fortune hung over every voyage. The Scottish economy at this point was like a thirsty gambler. The more they lost, the more they wanted to place a bigger bet to win it all back. It was from these dangerous smuggling runs and the sight of their ships sinking in other people's wars that a new idea began to germinate in the minds of the Scottish elite. We can't keep operating in the shadows forever. We need a territory of our own, a place where we are the masters of the game, free from British patrols and absurd navigation laws. The idea of Darien was the direct result of the pent-up frustration from those dramatic smuggling years. They wanted to turn Panama into an official smuggling superport, where they could trade openly with the entire world without having to care about their grumpy neighbors' feelings. The irony of history is that the elite smuggling skills the Scots honed during this period became the secret weapon that allowed them to dominate imperial trade after 1707. But that was in the future. At that time, every successful run was just a temporary painkiller for a decaying body. The more they smuggled, the more they saw the injustice. The more they sought alternative markets, the more they felt isolated. Scotland realized that even if they were the best hide-and-seek players in the world, they were still playing on a field where the English owned all the rules. And when the game of hide-and-seek became too exhausting, when sea graves outnumbered tobacco crates arriving at port, Scotland knew they needed a miracle, or a grand gamble, to change their fate. Darien was that gamble. When all efforts at covert smuggling and risky night-walking voyages felt like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon, the Scots understood they could no longer remain economic foster children. The navigation acts had become a towering brick wall, blocking every legitimate path to prosperity. And in that moment of ultimate deadlock, a crazy, magnificent, and desperate idea was born. It bore the fateful name Darien. This was not just an ordinary colonial plan, but an all-in gamble by an entire nation at a casino located in the heart of a tropical jungle, a place where they believed they would find the master key to shatter every shackle the English had imposed. The reason the Scots believed so fiercely in Darien stemmed from a logic that was simple yet bitter. If the English won't let us share their playground, we will build a stadium of our own. They looked at the world map with eyes burning with hope and stopped at the Isthmus of Panama. In the minds of Glasgow merchants and the Edinburgh elite at the time, Darien was not a swamp full of mosquitoes and malaria, but a geopolitical gold mine. They believed that if they could occupy this narrow strip of land connecting two oceans, Scotland would naturally become the gatekeeper of the world. Every ship carrying silks from the east or silver from the west would have to stop at the Scottish fort, unload cargo, and pay a fee. Most importantly, at Darien, the English navigation acts would be nothing more than worthless scrap paper. The Scots would be free to buy tobacco, free to sell linen, and free to laugh in the faces of London customs officials who were red-faced with anger over lost tax revenue. It was a vision too sweet to refuse, the only exit for Scotland to escape poverty and the grip of their difficult neighbor. However, the Scots forgot one thing. Their king, William III, though wearing the Scottish crown, had his heart and his wallet in London. As the Darien project began raising capital and the first ships weighed anchor, the English financial world began to panic. They realized that if this plan succeeded, the monopoly of the British East India Company would collapse, and the navigation acts, the pride of the empire, would be pierced. Under immense pressure from London's tycoons, King William III committed an own goal for the history books. He issued a royal decree sent to all English governors in the Caribbean and North America with a ruthless message. Absolutely no support, no trade, and not even a slice of dry bread was to be sold to the Scottish settlers at Darien. This sabotage was intended to uproot them completely. Imagine the miserable Scots who had just crossed thousands of miles of sea, struggling with yellow fever and gnawing hunger in the Panama jungle. Suddenly seeing an English ship from Jamaica gliding past on the sea. They waved flags, they cried for help, they brought out gold to trade for food, but that ship only sailed silently by. English captains were forbidden from helping their own fellow subjects of the same king, citing the reason that doing so would violate trade regulations and the Navigation Acts. The English would rather let the Scots starve in the jungle than allow them to ruin the economic order that London had painstakingly built. This was no longer commercial competition, it was a total economic blockade aimed at the very survival of a nation. This calculated sabotage from the English side turned the Darien dream into a horrific nightmare. The Scots realized that no matter how brave they were, they could not win against a king who was intentionally abandoning them. The massive investment, equivalent to 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire Scottish nation, vanished into the Panama mud. When the last survivors returned home empty-handed and emaciated, despair blanketed every street in Edinburgh. Rage against the English rose higher than ever, but the grim reality was that Scotland was utterly exhausted. They had no money to build new ships, no capital for business, and no allies left to cling to. The inevitable consequence of the Darien tragedy was that Scotland fell into a state of national bankruptcy. Quite literally, the Navigation Acts had fulfilled their mission. They not only prevented Scotland from getting rich, but pushed the nation into a dead end where political independence became an unbearable burden. The English were waiting at the end of the road with an offer that could not be refused. They used the very money Scotland had lost in Panama as bait, promising compensation and opening colonial markets if Scotland agreed to the Union. Darien was the final chapter of an independent but impoverished Scotland, and the opening chapter of a controversial new one in the history of the United Kingdom. The despair named Darien proved a cruel lesson. In a world of empires, if you cannot break the rules of the game, you are forced to become part of the one who makes them. And so, after having strangled Scotland with the Maritime Act, and then watching their neighbor self-destruct in the Panamanian mud, the British decided to deliver the final blow. This was not an invasion with swords or guns, but a merger and acquisition, M&A, in the style of high society finance, where the Maritime Act, Scotland's #1 enemy, suddenly became a captivating bargaining chip on the political negotiating table. Imagine the British as a shrewd rich man, holding a golden key, access to the global market, and standing before his bankrupt, starving Scottish brother, saying in an extremely polite manner, "Look, I can help you get out of this debt, even let you share this golden key, but in return, you must dissolve your own office and become an employee in my corporation." The Union 1707 condition was essentially an economic gamble disguised as a political one. Britain bluntly declared, "You want to trade tobacco freely without being caught? You want to transport sugar to Glasgow without paying us taxes? Simply put, stop being strangers." They stipulated that Scotland would only enjoy free trade, that is, the complete removal of the terrible restrictions of the Maritime Act, if and only if they agreed to abolish the Scottish Parliament and merge into a unified United Kingdom. This was a devastating psychological blow, as the British knew that after the Darien disaster, self-respect was the only thing left for the Scots, but their hunger was more intense than ever. For Scottish merchants, especially the future tobacco tycoons in Glasgow, this was a painfully agonizing but also brutally practical choice. They stood at a crossroads. On one side, they could continue to uphold their independence, but live in perpetual poverty, complete isolation, and watch their country gradually transform into a backward, isolated province of Europe under the constraints of the Maritime Act. On the other side was a colossal trade-off, relinquishing political sovereignty and the self-determination of an 800-year-old kingdom in exchange for a passport to the global market. It was a choice between a glamorous but empty title and a promising reality of prosperity. They understood that in a world where power is measured by balance sheets, Independence without finances was nothing more than a new form of slavery. The irony was that the very Maritime Act that the Scots once hated so intensely was now the biggest reason they had to agree. The British played a brilliant long game. They created a problem, the economic blockade, waited for that problem to cause a catastrophe, Darien, and then appeared as a savior with the solution, annexation. The Scottish elite, who had lost all their fortunes in the Panama Papers, looked at the 398,085 pounds that the British promised as compensation, also known as the equivalent, as a last lifeline. They realized that without this annexation, they would never have enough capital to rebuild their country, and more importantly, they would forever be locked outside the customs walls of the British Empire. And so, the annexation took place in a highly controversial atmosphere, where insults of traitors selling out the country for gold echoed through the streets of Edinburgh. But inside Parliament, the numbers spoke louder than patriotism. Merchants and nobles chose a trade-off. They accepted Scotland becoming part of the vast machinery operated by London in exchange for being allowed to legally sail tobacco ships to America. This was a trade-off of sovereignty for economic survival, an event that many historians later called the greatest bribe in history. But from a commercial perspective, it was a strategic merger that completely changed the destiny of both nations. The consequences of this trade-off unfolded so quickly that even the English were surprised. As soon as the Treaty of Union came into effect in 1707, the shackles of the Maritime Act were lifted for the Scots. Glasgow merchants, who had been seasoned in smuggling and circumventing the law for so many years, were now free to enter the legitimate market. They swarmed the American colonies with frenzied energy, using their very survival skills from their time of oppression to defeat their English rivals on their home turf. In just a few decades, Glasgow transformed from a poor port into the world's tobacco trading center. The Scots not only gained access to the global market, but they gradually took control of it. Looking back at this whole process, we see a profound irony. The Maritime Acts were originally created to restrain Scotland, but ultimately they became the most effective tool for forcing Scotland to join and enrich the British Empire. The British wanted to annex Scotland to secure their borders and quell competition, but they didn't realize they had just opened the door to a pack of economically hungry tigers. Scotland lost its own parliament, its supreme self-determination, but in return, it gained an empire to govern. The Darien tragedy and the stranglehold of the Maritime Act taught the Scots a cruel lesson. In the modern world, true sovereignty doesn't lie in constitutional documents, but in the ability to control the flow of money and goods. And when they signed the annexation in 1707, they not only ended an independent kingdom, but began an era in which the Scots would become the brain and heart of the most powerful empire in human history, all beginning with the painful trade-off of escaping the shadow of the Maritime Act.